Welcome to the Brisbane Property Podcast with your hosts Melinda and Scott Jennison.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast. Bit of an interesting one. We're going to have a chat today and talk about flight paths here in Brisbane. They have changed over the last couple of years. So we'll go back and talk about when the second runway was constructed and opened, and we'll give you some feedback, obviously, that people have come back into about the noise of the flight paths that the planes have actually, how things have changed for the locals, and what they're looking to do to rectify that.
Yes, welcome back to another episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast. You may or may not have heard in the news just recently that there have been some proposed new flight paths for Brisbane that have been released for community feedback, and therefore the purpose of this podcast is to help you to understand some of the winners and losers in terms of suburbs based on these proposals. But, you know, like anything, you know, the proposed flight paths, they're not set in concrete. So as a community, you do get the opportunity to have a say. And there's, I think, 13 locations where you can actually go and cast your vote and provide your feedback over the next few weeks so that you actually have your voice heard. And then Air Services Australia will have the opportunity to collaborate or potentially collect that community feedback and potentially make those changes, incorporating the voice of the people. Because, you know, I know for a fact that there's been so many articles published in the local newspaper here in Brisbane, the Courier Mail, since the second runway opened back in 2020, where noise complaints have absolutely skyrocketed since that $1.1 billion second runway opened. As a result of that, we saw a big shift in the flight paths here in Brisbane, and not only the flight paths, but the noise impact areas. So there's some suburbs that just were never previously impacted by plane noise that fell directly under the new flight pathways. So there's a lot of residents that, you know, are unhappy with that change that has occurred, but ultimately, you know, those residents and others are all able to submit their feedback in terms of what the proposed changes could look like when Air Services Australia update the Brisbane flight paths in the very near future.
So as Melinda said, back in July 2020, Brisbane's second runway opened up after about 15 years of planning and construction. The numbers are expected to increase to 50 million by 2035, and obviously it was something that was required for Brisbane to grow, for, you know, obviously for leisure and business, to help people travel around the world.
Just to clarify, not the plane numbers, but the passenger numbers.
Passenger numbers.
Yes. Obviously, Brisbane is a growing city, so the volume of people coming to and leaving from Brisbane as a domestic destination, but also an international destination, is expected to rapidly increase in the coming years.
Yeah. And just to also help people understand when we talk about the noise and the impact of the noise, we talk about like the 70 decibels is something that will interfere with people speaking indoors. So when we talked about, and Melinda did mention about some of the suburbs that have been heavily impacted, we'll just run through probably the 10 most probably affected suburbs that have actually been impacted the most from that. So flights above 70 decibels, once we've got the two runways up and running. So the most probably impacted here, Balmoral, 20 to 49 flights. Hammond, 20 to 49 flights. Cannon Hill, again, 20 to 49 flights. Pinkenba, 20 to 49 flights. Hawthorn, 10 to 19. Hamilton, 10 to 19. Seven Hills, 10 to 19. Ascot, 5 to 9. Bulimba, 5 to 9. And New Farm, 2 to 4.
So these are the number of flights per day that pass overhead in these suburbs that are actually considered a noise impact. So it doesn't mean to say that there's not more flights that pass over, but these are the number of flights that actually are recorded as being higher than 70 decibels in volume, or in the noise that you can actually hear. Now, remember, a lot of these suburbs were not previously impacted when Brisbane was operating its airport with a single runway only. In fact, Balmoral had no flights, and it's now one of the most significantly impacted suburbs across all of Brisbane. We even had Hawthorn that didn't have any flight impact previously. And even suburbs like Hamilton, they only had minimal flights. Ascot was not previously affected. So there's definitely been a shift off the back of the opening of the second runway. So perhaps residents that lived in some of these suburbs that have been impacted by the opening of the second runway had no previous impact. They've had reason to complain. Potentially they've lived in these areas long term and never expected to actually have that level of impact overhead. Of course, there's daytime impact. That for most people is actually less noticeable, but there's also that nighttime impact. And as we know, most international airports, and certainly Brisbane International Airport, it's a 24-hour airport. And what that means is that you can expect to have a level of impact if you are in a suburb that is under a flight path at any time of the day. Common sense prevails that the majority of flights will actually occur during the daytime hours, especially domestic flights. But there are some of those long-haul international flights that are arriving in the very early hours of the morning or departing in the very late hours of the evening. And I know when you're tucked up in bed and, you know, everything else is quiet around you, that noise impact can really be exacerbated. And it might sound even more, it might sound even louder in the evening than it is during the daytime. So, you know, there's definitely going to be some changes proposed. So it's important to know if your suburb is at risk or a suburb that you're looking to purchase in, because this is going to influence the livability and the enjoyment, certainly the peaceful enjoyment of some of these locations in the future.
And there's some big name suburbs when you look at that. And if people that know Brisbane, you know, when you're talking New Farm, Ascot, Hamilton, Bulimba, these sort of areas, Balmoral, there's some really big known suburbs there that do get affected and have become more and more affected from the second runway. So
there's definitely been a lobbyist group as well that have formed off the back of the opening of that second runway. And there's a growing voice of concern from residents that have experienced this heavy flight noise impact. I know, Scott, on some properties that we've inspected in some of these locations for clients, you know, sometimes you have to stop a conversation because the planes flying overhead are actually low enough to actually impact on that conversation. So I think you've joked about throwing a stone and hitting the undercarriage of the planes.
Yeah, not that I'd do that.
Not at all.
So what we're going through here now, obviously that's what's happened and how this has all come about now and why this has happened is they're now seeking community feedback. So obviously there has been enough complaints and there's people that have talked about this, how this has affected their life and their property and where they live. So what they're doing now is they're looking to get some community feedback and there's several places where they're going to be holding this. I think there's about 13 community consultation sessions that they're actually holding. And they will seek feedback with some options and some ideas to reduce or share the load. A lot of different things to look at, I guess, and consider how this can be improved for everyone.
Yeah, look, I think that Air Services Australia do want to engage in extensive community engagement before the new plans are implemented. They want to give everyone a voice, as I've mentioned. And that way, you know, if you do have concerns or if your suburb's going to be impacted by these proposed changes, it is time to actually raise your hand and voice your concerns, because those concerns may be considered before the new flight paths come out. I know that there's, you know, some clients that we've partnered with, some friends that we know that live in locations, especially in the inner southeastern suburbs of Brisbane, where regardless of whether you're in a flight path or not, quite often flight or aircraft do not follow the exact flight path. So you might not actually be in a flight path or in a noise overlay for that matter, but you may actually experience significant plane noise overhead in the evening if you are in those inner southeastern suburbs. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Obviously, when we drive a car, we have a lane that we stay in the air. There's, I guess, more scope for movement outside of the exact flight path. So just because your home or your property may not be in a designated flight path. It doesn't guarantee that the planes won't fly overhead if that flight path is nearby. So that's also something to keep in mind, both now, but also in the future with any proposed changes.
So just to give people a little bit of an idea, if you're not a local, obviously the locals will have a fair idea about this, but to give you a bit of an idea where the airport is situated, if you head to the north, you will go out over Moreton Bay. So you'll exit or enter from the north to the airport. It is Moreton Bay, and a lot of them do zoom around from the bay there and come in over the water. If you're on the south side, you basically head over land. So you'll go up, you'll go over the gateway, the river, and from there, that's where you hit all these suburbs like the Balimbas and that area. So to the south is more land. To the north, obviously, is the bay.
And I think the biggest thing with the way flights are planned to take off is it is very weather dependent. There's been a very big push for a lot of the flights to be redirected to both take off and land over Moreton Bay, which would naturally cause more planes to fly into Brisbane or out of Brisbane over water, which would, of course, reduce the noise impact on a lot of people living in some of those Southside locations. However, the reality is certain weather conditions prohibit planes from taking off or landing in that direction or from that direction. And so therefore, there must be overland pathways that are in place. And it is the proposed changes to the overland pathways that we'd like to discuss today, because, you know, the proposed new routes that have been put forward for community consultation focus on reducing the impact of nighttime operations and pushing as many of those nighttime flights over the bay. But if they cannot come through or leave over the bay, then there's different changes proposed, and we're going to run through those. It's also proposed that they're wanting to keep aircraft over the water for longer. So if there is any turning required to redirect over land, that their planes are at a higher altitude by the time they have turned to come back over the land. And the final focus for the new proposals is to have the aircraft climb higher prior to crossing the coastline. So if they are taking off over the land, then obviously having the ability to be at a higher altitude before they cross the land reduces the noise impact on local residents nearby. So
as you mentioned, and that's what, again, people need to understand is when you start to get exposed to the weather, and when you do hit that bay, you open up a little bit more to the elements. So out over the bay, the winds can get quite strong, and obviously then with rain as well. So rain and wind will have an effect. The first one that with one of the options we'll have a chat about is the early turn option. So this is planes basically heading to the south. As they take off, they will look to turn, almost do a U-turn basically. So take off and then do quite a sharp turn towards the east. And head out towards the Bay Area straight away as much as they can. It will probably hit areas, the Bayside suburbs, a little bit more. So it won't head down towards the south as much. They'll turn sharp and head towards the Bayside suburbs.
Yes, so this is one of the 6 proposed new aircraft routes. It's the early turn opportunity for planes that are heading to the south, as Scott mentioned, but also planes heading east or to the northeast, because they will turn once they have taken off. And as Scott has rightly pointed out, the early turn option is after takeoff, taking a very direct turn to the left, and communities that include Eagle Farm, Manly and Wynnum will be significantly impacted by this change. So if you are actually close to these suburbs, such as Wynnum and Manly, you will face aircraft noise that is as loud as a vacuum cleaner under this proposed option to share the pain from the Brisbane Airport traffic. If that is a concern for you, you might like to actually attend one of the community consultation sessions that have been proposed to have your say, because it is time to have your say in the event that you don't agree with some of these proposals that are being put forward.
There are a few industrial areas in there as well, so which is probably why they're looking at this proposal as an option, because as you turn sharp and you do Eagle Farm, I mean, that area there is some residential there, but as you head away from there, you'll obviously come across some industrial area. But yeah, Wynnum, Manly and those Bayside suburbs, they would be affected more than what they are currently as well.
Yeah, definitely something to keep in mind because there's currently no noise impact from planes in those locations. So I'm just going to run through all of the locations that are not currently impacted but will be impacted by this proposed change. I've mentioned a few, but here is the exhaustive list. Eagle Farm, Green Island, Hemmant, Manly West, Moreton Island, Murarrie, Pinkenbar, Tingalpa, Wynnum and Wynnum West. If your suburb has been listed as part of those suburbs, this is the early turn option that may impact you if it is implemented as a permanent change. So you might like to have your say.
Those relaxing over at Tangalooma might be in a bit of a shock when they're relaxing over at Tangalooma feeding the dolphins and a jet flies over them over Moreton Bay.
Yeah, I think the other big flight path change, and as I mentioned, there's 6 of them. We're not going to go through all of them, but one of the other very big ones that will impact people is the option for nighttime overland departures for planes that are heading to the north. So I think it's important to highlight that whilst the idea is to send more planes out over the bay, that is just not possible in all weather conditions. So when the wind is southerly during the day, planes must take off over the land from both runways, and this is due to safety reasons. So when that actually happens, obviously there's different proposals that are being put in place to share the pain of that overland impact of plane noise and flight path noise. So things could actually get a little bit worse for some inner city suburbs, but they could get better for those living further away. And that is if residents go for the option to make planes that do fly over the land climb faster. So that option is that once aircraft do leave and they are taking off over the land, the aircraft would climb much more steeply on the existing alignment. So the flight path itself would not change, but the altitude or the speed at which planes reach a desired altitude would increase. Now, what that would mean is increased engine noise in inner city locations instead of shared engine noise throughout a number of suburbs. So if you are in the inner city, very close to the airport and already in a flight path, this may impact you. And remember, this is for overnight flights. So this is when you will hear that impact the most.
Yeah. So basically, they accelerate really fast and take off quite steep. That will have an impact probably more on, I presume, the areas that are in the noise impacted areas now, and will congest that in a bit tighter. It will share it a little bit, obviously, because once they get up above and they get to some green space, they can then target those areas to try and move away from the highly dense areas where a lot of communities are. So different way to do it. It could have a little bit of quite a loud impact in some areas as well. That could be quite loud.
Yeah, look, some of the most desirable locations in the inner southeast are the suburbs that are most likely to be impacted by this option. But this is not the only option for that nighttime overland flight departure. And so if you are in some of those locations, including Balmoral or Hawthorn or Bulimba, and you do want your say, then perhaps you might like to put forward one of the other options that's being proposed for nighttime flights, and that is that the aircraft could track on a different alignment. So instead of targeting the existing flight paths that are already in place, looking at areas where there is still some green space, and this would then shift the aircraft over different communities. Now, of course, we're looking at a very densely populated part of Brisbane, so we don't yet know what the proposed pathways might be for areas that have more green space, because there's very little of that available. And in any regard, that would still impact those that are in those inner city locations. The third option for that nighttime departure is that the love could be shared, or the impact could be shared, I should say, in that aircraft could fly over different communities on different days of the week. Now, obviously, at the moment, all of the flights share the same flight path, regardless of what day of the week it is. So the third option for nighttime departures is that the aircraft fly over different suburbs in different locations, depending on what day of the week it is. So you might be the Sunday night flight impacted area, and someone else might be the Friday night flight impacted area. But these are the options being considered.
Yeah, I think that'll be one for debate, because some people will be quite happy to say, let's share it around. I think that the others that have been asked to share it might not be as favourable to that idea to share them as well. The turning fast seems like, quite a decent idea to try and get them out of the bay. Obviously, the more planes you can get over the bay, the better. Gets them away from above people's houses and disturbing everyone. So obviously being close to the bay, but because we've only got that northerly sort of access to it, that is probably the most. As many planes as you can get to the north, the better, I think. Yeah,
and I think the third option, or the third pathway that is due to change that we'd like to draw your attention to, is changes to the turboprop planes. Again, for overland departures between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. Now, these are the planes that you might hear taking off early for a lot of the FIFO workers. They'll be leaving early and they'll be taking off over the land. The proposal is for the new runway to be used for turboprop aircraft movements, which then can eliminate or change the suburbs that are actually being impacted. Or the other option is to reduce overflight community flights with these turboprop aircraft. So basically any aircraft operating from the legacy runway, which is the original runway, would turn immediately left once they reach 600 feet. This is getting very technical, but it basically will change the direction of the aircraft that are leaving early in the morning.
So sharing the noise, taking off fast, turning fast. The other thing to remember with this as well, and this is, as we've said, this is a community where they're after the feedback from the community. So I would strongly suggest to anyone that is in any area that is currently impacted as well, to get involved and have your say to try and make things better. But just keep in mind that it's always subject to change. That's probably the biggest thing to remember about this. Is it's the first lot that was put out was everyone thought, well, that's the new pathway and that's the way the planes are going to go. And literally within 2.5 years later, we're looking to change again. So you've got to keep that in mind when you start to look at property as well. It could change, it could be impacted. So that's something you really have to understand and keep in your mind, and make sure you do your research when you're looking at property that is anywhere near an airport.
Absolutely. Great advice there. And I think that it's always something that we will draw people's attention to when they are looking to purchase either a home or an investment property. It's always important that you understand whether that potential property is likely to be noise impacted. Plain noise has absolutely no concern for some people, but for other people that can be a deal breaker. It depends on your sensitivity and what you're familiar with. I know I was just speaking to someone last week who was making an inquiry about buying in Brisbane, and they're from Sydney and they've lived under a flight path in Sydney. So absolutely no concern for someone that is used to that and familiar with that noise. But for someone else that might be moving from a quieter location, living under a flight path, or certainly within a noise overlay, can actually have significant disturbance to your quality of life, because that can really impact on your peaceful enjoyment of your property. So it's something that you should always be aware of when you are considering a particular location. And as Scott has rightly pointed out, just because the flight paths are as they are today, it doesn't guarantee that they will always be in the same position. Obviously, the closer you are to the airport and the closer you are to the runway points that do fly over the land, the more likely you are to have that impact over the longer term. So this is just something that you need to be aware of when selecting a location to purchase your home or investment.
Excellent. Well, I think we've covered a little bit there. There's obviously more to research and more thinking for people to do. Get involved in those community the feedbacks if you can, and if you've, as I said, if it's something that you will be impacted by. So look, hopefully that was good information. We'll wrap it up there and close out as Melinda normally does for you. And thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now.
Yes, thanks so much for joining us once again on the Brisbane Property Podcast. We hope, as always, you have enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please leave us a review on iTunes and share this episode with your friends and family, especially if they are looking to buy in Brisbane and they have a phobia around noise or flight movements. Thank you for joining us once again. We'll speak to you again next week. Bye for now.